So we've now defined what child sexual abuse is and what child sexual exploitation is. Child sexual abuse, you know, is sexual contact between an adult and a child of any nature. And there's certain kinds of sports where sexual contact can occur very surreptitiously. Some of those sports for an adult and a child, for example, would include swimming. If you have an adult in a pool with a child swimmer and they are helping that child with some of their swimming skills, there is an easy opportunity for an offender to fondle a child under those circumstances because they're in the water, the child is sort of, did I feel that? I'm just not sure. A lot of the whole butt patting stuff we know is sort of a sports kind of behavior. You did a good job, pat, pat. But one of the things that we teach with respect to prevention to children, there's a role that we teach to children, there's a role that we teach to families, there's a role that we teach to the community, and then there's a role that we try to teach to society. But one of the things that we teach to children is that you don't have to let people touch you where you don't want to be touched. It's okay for you to say, no, nobody does that to me. One of the things that I try to teach pediatricians is that when they're doing a complete physical examination on a child, and they have to do a genital exam, which is part of the physical examination, for a child who's verbal, when I'll do everything first, and then I'm now going to take a look at the penis and testicles or the child's vagina, and I will have the child sit back up. I will say to them, Johnny, I first ask the parent, what does your child call their penis and testicles? Oh, he calls it his wee-wee. Okay. So Johnny, Dr. Cooper has to take a look at your wee-wee and make sure it's okay. But you know what? Nobody can touch your wee-wee unless your mommy says it's all right. So you have to ask her first. And he looks at his mommy like a deer in the headlights. And I'll say, can you go ahead and ask your mommy, Mommy, is it okay? Yes, honey, because she's a doctor and she's going to make sure you're all right. Then I have that parent come and stand next to the child when I'm examining the child's genitals, because I'm trying to role model to the parent that this is what you should be saying to your child all the time, not just in my office. This is what you need to be saying to your child. Nobody can touch you. It's not okay. You know, it's not okay to do that. That's a component of prevention that empowers children. It empowers children. One of the things that is not likely to happen at a camp scenario unless it's a parental abduction scenario. If a non-custodial parent, for example, came to a campsite while a child was at a camp for the week and gave some excuse as to why he needed to remove his or her child from that camp during that week, that could potentially be a parental abduction scenario. Don't know if you all talk about that at all in your situations and in your policies and everything, but parental abductions are the most common abductions. They're far more common than stranger abductions. Parental abductions are much more common. And the reason that that's important is because there are prevention programs out there for just child abductions in general. Rad Kids, put out by Ed Smart, is one of those programs that goes to various schools and youth serving organizations and uses that particular model of teaching kids how to yell and scream and say, this is not my dad, this is not my dad, not just yell and scream. You know, a stranger grabs your child, they yell and scream, the abductor will typically say, oh, she's just having a temper tantrum, or he's just really mad that I told him we have to go home, and people will walk away. They will just say, oh yeah, that kid's really having a temper tantrum. But to teach a child to say, this is not my dad, this is not my dad, will get other people's attention right away, won't they? If they have a child who's screaming and hollering, et cetera, in that situation. So that's just an aside. So let's talk about that fighting. How does child sexual abuse present? Well, first of all, I already explained to you that children do not disclose this in childhood most of the time. And when it is discovered during childhood, the most common way that it occurs is that a child makes a disclosure, a child victim makes a disclosure, or somebody starts to question the child because the child has had some change in behavior, or they're acting in a sexualized manner, or something like that. That's the most common thing that happens. And when children do make a disclosure, the most common person that they disclose to is a peer, a best friend, or a best friend's parent, not their own parent necessarily, especially if it's an interfamilial case. Or the other way in which child sexual abuse is discovered is because there's been an eyewitness. A parent walks into the room and finds somebody in bed with their child, or a child disrobed for some reason and underneath the covers, and nobody's in the room with them, but the child doesn't have any clothes on from the waist down. Why is it you don't have your pants on? And the child gets really frightened, et cetera, because the child is afraid. They feel that they've done something wrong, when in fact they may not have done anything. Someone has done something to them. And sometimes it presents because there's been a change in the child's behavior that can either reflect the trauma or sexual experiences. So the dynamics of disclosure is that, remember, the most likely offender is going to be a family member or an acquaintance. And this realization means that the non-disclosure is the rule more so than the exception. And I already told you about the research from Dr. Rochelle Hansen, and we know that males are even less likely to disclose. So the term that is used in the literature regarding this non-disclosure is silencing. A child has been silenced because it is a person who knows them well, whom the child trusts, etc., and now there's been a breach of that trust. So in your handout, I just abbreviated youth serving organizations because it was a lot of letters, so now you know what that is. I had to put the hyphen because YSO typically means youth sex offender. So I put a little hyphen there so that it wasn't youth sex offender. So sometimes children will disclose because they feel they're in a safe place. Is camp a safe place? Yes, it is. And so you may have a disclosure that occurs while a child is in camp. They may disclose because they feel that they're with a trusted adult. They may be with a chaperone who's therefore not the offender. In fact, I remember when I was a resident, the very first case of child sexual abuse I ever saw as a resident was a kid who was on a Boy Scout camping trip. And he told his scoutmaster, that his father had been sexually abusing him while they were out on this camping trip. And the scoutmaster did not know what to do. He knew the father, of course, you know, all that sort of stuff. It was faith-based kind of thing. But the scoutmaster did not know what to do. And I remember that they brought the child to our emergency room. That's one way to do it. And the child's in our emergency room, and he says he's 11 years old, and he said, you know, my daddy would always make me put his pee-pee in my mouth, all that sort of thing. And I can tell you that the emergency room, this is a long time ago, the emergency room, the child got admitted to the hospital because nobody knew what to do. And we would never admit a child sexual abuse case today, but that's what happened then. He was on our ward for about 8 days because we wanted a child psych evaluation of this child. Now, there's good and bad to this. A child psych evaluation seems like, okay, they might be the right people to interview a child and get all the real deal. But Carmen knows that they are not the right people to do that, because what child psych people do is they make psychiatric diagnoses. And the decision was, is he schizophrenic? Is he delusional? You know, all of those psychiatric diagnoses started floating around the table. So when it came time for us to decide about discharge of this child, we had a big meeting of all the people on the child abuse team, so that was a good start. It was all the people on the child abuse team. And the group was split right down the middle. Half of the table said, this child just might be telling the truth. Just might be. Half the table said, we think he needs to go to an inpatient setting for mental health treatment. That just shows you how it was in those days. And this is a child who made a disclosure to a trusted adult at a camp. All right, so that back row, you guys, back row. I'll come sit with you because you're just the two of you, but I'm not helping you. So you are the camp folks, and a child comes up to you 7 o'clock in the evening during that time that Mike tells me about. Everybody's in the cabin just talking, and they say, can I tell you a secret? Can I just tell you a secret? Now, let's start there. What are you going to say?
Of course.
Okay, let me bring you up front because, and you can come too, because you have a camera back there. Listen to her, she says, oh my goodness. Okay, this is called role playing, and it's kind of helpful. So can I tell you a secret?
Sure.
Tell me your name.
Carrie.
Miss Carrie, you know, I'm kind of scared to go back home again, you know, because bad things happen to me at home. Can you help me?
Sure, of course. Let's talk about it.
Okay. She's a brave person, isn't she? It's like, and tell me your name.
Victoria.
Well, you know, you and Miss Victoria, you all were so nice to me today when we were outside playing, and I just feel like, you know, sometimes when I go to sleep at night, things happen to me at my house, and I don't know, maybe I'm just having a bad dream. Can you help me?
So then I'd probably want to figure out exactly who the right person is to have this conversation, because it probably wouldn't be me.
I know, so Miss Victoria, she's going to step forward. Come on over, Miss Victoria. So what do you think, Miss Victoria? You think I'm just kind of having a bad dream, and you know, but it kind of hurts me when I go pee-pee the next morning when I have those bad dreams. Can you help me?
I think I definitely find the right person to talk to, or maybe, I mean, if she's in a camp setting, talk to her chaperone who can then help out with that.
Okay, now you have to be careful about talking to her chaperone. Carmen, tell us about that.
Well, don't know, it could be the chaperone.
Sure could be.
The chaperone could have a very close relationship with the offending
Potential
parent,
offender.
Or,
Mhm.
or if it's not the parent, then the person, they may have a relationship, right? So
Right.
more than likely you want to call, you want to report to the authorities and have someone come in.
Right, absolutely. And how would you make that child feel good about having even reached out to you? What would you all say? So tell me, you're going to now tell me that you're going to have somebody else talk to him, but.
Right, and to let them know that I hear what they're saying, and to make them feel comfortable that it's something that we want to talk a little bit more about, and that the right people are the right person is gonna talk to them, that we're gonna contact, so we can handle it in the appropriate way.
Thank you, because I just knew you all were nice people and that you would help me not have these bad dreams. Because I don't want to have bad dreams anymore. Can you help me? Will you help me? Thank you.
Oh,
thank
that's why
you.
we give him such a big hug.
That's exactly right. So see, that is the kind of thing that can happen in a camp. And we do need to be prepared if a child makes a disclosure under those settings, right? Did you feel too terribly stressed out?
No.
Okay, good. You did well. They won't have nightmares tonight. So they may tell a trusted adult. They usually disclose not because they want to get somebody in trouble. They usually disclose because they want the abuse to stop. That's the main reason the children disclose. Did you have a question? No? Okay. They may disclose to a friend who encourages them to talk to an adult in a youth-serving organization because they may bond with those individuals in that youth-serving, but they may fail to disclose to you because of guilt, shame, and self-blame. Those are the three feelings that children have when they've been sexually abused: guilt, shame, and self-blame. Those are the most common ones. So there's some legal concerns. This is a really important component. Same child says, why don't you two come up? Love that look of, I can't wait. Really? Okay, so tell me your name.
Janice.
Janice.
Rosina.
Okay, Rosina. Okay, you all come stand right over here a little bit. You are standing away from me. Okay, so I'm the child, and I'm going to start out by saying the same thing. You know, I've been having bad dreams since I got here. This is different. This is a different story, right? Because now the dreams have happened only since she's been at camp. I've been having bad dreams since I got here that you know, maybe something's happening to me when I was asleep last night, you know, in my cabin. Can I talk to you about it?
Of course.
Well-
Absolutely.
Will I get in trouble?
No, you won't get in any trouble.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to tell you was that Sally told me that somebody in her cabin, somebody touched her in her cabin. And so I've been trying to stay awake because I don't want anybody to touch me, but I fell asleep last night and I kind of thought maybe somebody touched me last night. What can I do? You all can talk to each other. Like, oh my God, what should we do?
We should probably try to, I guess, figure out who the chaperones are in this.
Yeah, who stays in the cabin with them?
Who's staying in the cabin with me, or who's staying in the cabin with Sally, who's in a different cabin? Right, right. What is it about what I said that should make them be more worried about what I said? In other words, somebody told me that somebody touched them in another cabin, and so now I'm afraid somebody is touching me in my cabin, is what I said. So does this mean that I'm at high risk to have been sexually touched in my cabin? No. It means that I am high risk to have been contaminated because somebody told me about something in another cabin. Do you see the difference? That's called suggestibility. That's when somebody else says something to a child and the child says, maybe that happened to me too, which means that the likelihood that it happened to this child is not high. But that, and furthermore, if she were on a witness stand and they said, what do you remember? Well, somebody told me such and such, and so I think maybe it might have happened to me. Now, you could have a serial offender in your cabins. Let's hope not. Well, let's hope that they're not going from cabin to cabin. But that, just the fact that the child starts out by saying, someone told me this, should make you feel concerned about who told them that, but have a little less concern regarding the victim who's telling you, because it's usually anxiety that's making the child think, well, maybe this happened to me because I heard about it in somebody else's cabin. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Are you all okay?
Yes.
What about like kids who say like this happened to my friend? Do kids ever say like?
Yes, children do say that at times. Usually it's older children. Young children between about 6 and 10 rarely do that. But what she's talking about is a child who's talking about themselves, but they don't want you to know that they're talking about themselves. So they'll say, I have a friend who this happened to them, when in reality they're really talking about themselves. That's more likely to occur from an older child, an adolescent, who's feeling you out as to how you're going to respond to that. Another piece is that I'm going to now be a different child. See, you're already up here. Okay. I want you to react how you would normally react, okay? Are you ready? Help me, help me. Johnny in that cabin right down the way, he hurt my peepee. He hurt my peepee. Can you help me, please?
What happened?
I don't know. I can't talk about it. It's so bad.
I'll tell you to relax and breathe, and so we can understand. So I can ask again what happened.
Well, I want you to go and get him. He's a bad boy. Can you go get him now? Because he was really mean to me. The ball is in your court.
We're gonna take care of you, and we're gonna ask somebody else to go talk to Johnny and find out what happened.
That's a pretty good answer. That's a pretty good answer. What do you all think? How would you all respond? You have this hysterical child. She's telling you that something has just happened to her. Now, children will make that kind of disclosure most commonly when something has happened and it's a stranger. The most common way in which children will react like that is if somebody has not groomed them, they haven't made them comfortable, they haven't had them come sit in their lap all the time. What type of offender, okay, this is a board question, what type of offender is most likely as a stranger to sexually assault a child in a camp?
What type?
I could give you a hint.
Volunteer.
That's the answer. A youth offender. A youth offender is the most likely type of person who will sexually assault a child just de novo. None of that grooming stuff, none of that I think you're lovely or all that kind of stuff. They just say, come here, and grab and pull you behind the cabin and sexually assault them. That's, in fact, 75% of youth sex offenders will penetrate a child the first time they're ever with them, 75%. So that, and I hope I didn't frighten you all too much. You can have a seat. That's a different kind of scenario, which who's prepared for that? All of us need to be prepared for that. All of us need to be thinking about who would make a child so frightened, who would make a child so hysterical, and let them leave. See, a youth offender will let them leave. An adult stranger who sexually assaults a child like that won't leave the child to go tell somebody. They usually won't. They'll just do something with the child so that so the child cannot make a disclosure at all. Yes.
So in the case where it was a child telling us that they were afraid of their parents or their father, and I think it was Carmen that suggested you call the authorities, get social services involved.
Right.
If it's another youth at the camp and they're not from the, it's not in the home environment, do you bring in social services at that point as well to evaluate the?
Yes, there are two organizations that can be called. And you can either call law enforcement or you can call social services. Most people would call social services first, and social services often calls law enforcement if they find that it's going to have nothing to do with them. Because social services only handles offenders who are caretakers, people who are caretakers of a child. And I will tell you that in this day and age, and with the paucity of social workers in Child Protective Services Agency, they will listen to that telephone call and they'll say, is this person a caretaker? And you'll say, no, this is a 14-year-old in our camp. Well, we don't take this kind of case. Thank you very much for calling. And so then it has to go to law enforcement. On the other hand, though, if a child says, the person who did this to me is my cousin, and we both came to camp together, and I stay at his house a lot, and he did this to me out here in camp, then social services might get involved, because social services will sometimes look at a youth sex offender in a family as a neglect case. That a person, whoever the parent is in that family, especially if those children live together, a sibling, etc., is not supervising that youth offender enough. And so this is a neglect case. So that's kind of the difference. But if it turns out that what they're talking about is another youth, a 14-year-old and she's 10, you already have that 4-year age difference that I told you about, which makes it a crime. That's one part of it. But even if it's a 14-year-old and she's a 13-year-old, if there was force, fraud, or coercion in this particular situation, that's still against the law. Carmen, I would go ahead, and then I'll let
I
you.
was just gonna ask, I know a lot of folks ask with youth sex offenders.
Yes.
Were they offended against to begin with? How did they get to where they're at?
Right, right. Oh, that's a very good question. That has been a tenet in child maltreatment for a long time, that children who sexually offend against other children are doing that because they themselves have been victims of child sexual abuse. What the reality is that most children who've been sexually abused do not go on to offend against other people. That's the first thing to be aware of. Most kids who've been sexually abused go on to be good, upstanding, okay people in life. Those children who do sexually offend may have been victims, and one has to look for that, but they also may have mental health problems. They may have narcissism, or they may have psychopathy, etc. They may have mental health problems as the etiology where they don't care. What we do know about sex offenders in general, whether they're youths or adults, we know that all sex offenders will offend against children more commonly than they offend against adults, because children are easier to offend against. In other words, a person who's a sex offender in general will almost always have some children in their past history of having offended against, because they can be opportunistic offenders. And this child just happens to be in my space very easy. So a rapist doesn't have to be a pedophile. In other words, they don't have to just only want to have sex with children. They just can access children more readily. There was a research article that came out looking at convicted sex offenders who said that they had been sexually abused as children. And so this is, of course, DOJ made it available to me because it's the kind of article DOJ would have, Department of Justice. And in this particular population, I think there were 120 men who said they had been sexually abused as children as part of their pre-sentencing report, et cetera. And they did polygraphs on them. And they found that only 20% passed the polygraph, that they really had been sexually abused as children. Now, in pre-sentencing reports, people try to look at other things besides a person's word for what they're saying. They look for previous reports, some kind of Child Protective Services document, anything that may, in fact, validate what they're saying besides just their word for that. And most of the time, offenders will not agree to a polygraph if they're in the process of getting ready to be sentenced for a crime. But that's where that research is, that it's not nearly as common as we thought. With respect to those who are offending against others. You had a question.
So what happens just from a legal perspective? So a lot of our campers aren't local. So what would happen just from that perspective if you called local child services? Or?
Well, first of all, from a law enforcement perspective, the issue is where does the crime occur? So if it occurs in Maryland, it's Maryland law enforcement people who are going to be the first responders to respond to that. If it appears as if there's a Child Protective Services issue, the victims know each other, there's some kind of caretaker issue, even though the crime may have occurred here in this county or in this state, the caregivers are in wherever that child came from. So CPS would typically be notified. CPS would be notified here at first, and it's CPS here who would notify the CPS agency in that particular place. It's called an interstate contract. They have an agreement from state to state in that situation. Good question, very good question. Any other questions about that extraordinarily traumatic event for these, for Miss Janice and Miss Rosina, right, okay.